Good afternoon. My name is Rukia Sheikh-Mohamed. I'm a full stack developer from Minneapolis, currently working at Soona. I'm a new mom to the best baby boy, Loyan, and I am a survivor of the first 6 months of 2020. It feels like 10 years in the span of 6 months. It's been hectic. I've been in the tech world for a little over 3 years now, and I come from a non-traditional background, the legal field. I made the switch, and it was the best decision I've ever made, and I haven't looked back since. Over the years, there was lots of triumph, wins, met some awesome people, built really cool stuff, but there was also lots of failure, imposter syndrome, and broke some stuff, and overall learned a lot. This is why I want to share some helpful tips I learned along the way. I'm a strong believer of it's not about working harder, but working smarter. What do I mean by working smarter? In most problems, there's an easy way and a long, difficult way to get to a solution. For example, in math, the teacher teaches you the long, difficult way to solve an algebra question before she shows you how to do it via a scientific calculator. Programming is all about doing all the things via a scientific calculator. Working smarter ultimately gives you a priceless payoff, more time. In this talk, I'll be discussing 5 steps of getting unstuck. I feel like I'm an expert at getting unstuck, so let's dive in. Story time. During my first tech job, I was working on a team with all senior developers who've been in the industry for ages, and I was their first junior person on the team. It was difficult for me because of the obvious imposter syndrome, in addition to the lack of experience and support from my team members with a junior person. I was there first. There is a huge gap between me and the senior devs. But I learned a very valuable lesson from one of them. I asked for feedback on my tech performance, and one thing he said to me stuck with me my entire career. He said, You don't ask the right questions. I was confused because since elementary school, I was always taught that there's no such thing as a dumb question. I asked him to elaborate. He said, Rukia, when we work on a problem together that you're stuck on and you don't ask the right questions. When you're explaining the problem, you ask me yes or no versus open-ended questions. He went on elaborating himself. And I know he didn't directly say dumb question, but it was his Minnesota nice way of saying it. And I felt really confused at first and felt more like an imposter. Not only was I questioning my tech skills, but I was also questioning my questioning skills. I didn't even know that was a thing. But throughout my career, I used that convo as a motivation to constantly iterate on getting unstuck from my problems. Let's walk through a real life problem with my 5 steps on getting unstuck to get to the right solution. Let's see how we can solve this problem together. Side note, most of the terms I'll be using will be defined in the glossary for your reference, but I'll also briefly explain it as we go along. I'll be working on a problem with Ruby on Rails, which is a backend language for web application. Vue.js on my front end, which is an open source JavaScript framework. The example I'll be going through will be using RSpec, which is a testing tool written in Ruby, and Capybara, not the animal, but the library that allows us to easily stimulate how a user interacts with our app. The app I'm working on is a booking app with a login and create user page. Using Devise, which is a Rails gem for authentication. So my ticket states that I need a system test which allows the test user to interact with creating a system test which is allowing us to test user interaction within our application. I start by adding the test. Password cannot be blank. RSpec syntax is very readable, which for example, this test is saying create user should not be successful because password can't be blank. So when we visit, the new registration path is the same as saying visiting example.com/signup. There is a form with a couple input fields. So in the name, we're going to fill out tests, and in the email field, we're going to fill out test@example.com, and we're going to click the button create account. once we're not actually doing this, the system test is doing it for us, which is great. And so once that happens, we expect the page not password can't be blank because we didn't fill in a password. I go to my console and run my test, and it fails. I didn't expect this to fail, and I'm not sure why it did. So now let's go through step 1 of the 5 steps of getting unstuck. Step 1, start by doing your own troubleshooting. Do I have any helpful error messages, console logs, loud messaging that can direct me to the problem? This is an obvious step, but most people skip it, so be sure to pause and take some time to thoroughly read it. Here, I see lots of red, which is not good. I want to see green, which means passing. So let's start off by reading the error message. Looks like what I expect my page to see isn't actually there. It shows my home page instead. The reason why I know that is because Capybara is telling me what it expects to see versus what it actually sees. In step 1, we do have a helpful error message, which helps us understand our problem, but it's not enough to solve it. Little side note, I would like to point out if at any point during these 5 steps, if you get unstuck, stop at that step. For example, if you get unstuck after step 1, there's no need to go through the rest of the steps. Remember, this is all about working smarter. Okay, now moving on to step number 2. Start by Googling. Google specific queries. Make sure your question is specific for your example, not broad. This is an example of doing Google wrong. Like if you were stuck on a Rails migration problem, instead of Googling, why am I getting a Rails migration error? Instead, be more specific and say how to correctly roll back migration columns in Rails. So let's try step 2. For our example, a good way to narrow down your Google search is to be specific. We know our error, password cannot be blank. We know the tech we're using, Rails with RSpec, and Capybara testing and divides as our login authentication. I would stay away from copying and pasting the error message like in this example because it might not give you the most efficient answers. So now I will type a more specific question search in using step 2, which would be like how to test create user form within RSpec and Capybara. I search what I want to accomplish and why, and I'm using these 3 helpful tips. I include the language, the framework, and any tools I'm using. I also have a checklist that I go through, which is, did I include the specific language, list any frameworks or tools, 2 to 3 words, concise, what I'm trying to accomplish, and finally the obvious, putting in a questioning form. During step 2, most of the platforms I use are Stack Overflow, Dev, Medium, YouTube, and YouTube videos, and Thoughtbot. So Stack Overflow is my number 1 result, and Thoughtbot is my number 3 result. And Thoughtbot is good for this specific example because they create FactoryBot, which we're using as our fixture replacement, which all that means is it helps us produce our test data. I clicked through a couple of results and I couldn't get unstuck. So let's move on to step number 3. Yeah, these are some of the resources that I use. So step number 3. Look at other pieces of the puzzle. Take a zoom in and zoom out of the parts of the code. Walk through pieces of the code to see if you missed anything. What do I mean by this? Let's use our example. If we zoom into the code, if we zoom into our example, we see that the password cannot be blank. But how? It is blank. So what does that mean? So it is able to be blank. So that means our password is not required. Okay. Next, if we zoom out, we need to look at other files that this code affects. Rails is an MVC language, which means model, view, controller. So we should look at all 3, the user model, the view, and the controller. In our Vue.js code, everything we are passing in our password input field seems to be correct. We're using vValidatable, a Vue.js library to validate our password field. And so that seems to be looking good. Now let's look at our user model. In Rails, we're using it to develop our user class for create user, where we use methods, validations, and much more. For the sake of time, let's say I looked over the model and the controller and I didn't notice anything. So now let's move on to step number 4. Ask a coworker, a classmate, someone. Don't try to do it alone. Asking someone is a tool which benefits you and the person alike. Sometimes in step 4, you'll get unstuck simply by speaking out loud to another person and explaining your thought process. In tech, we call that rubber ducking. When you use someone or an actual rubber duck to talk through your thought process, similar to a rubber duck on your desk. This step, like others, might seem pretty obvious, but it's not always done efficiently. From my story in the beginning, you recall the deaf saying, "I don't ask the right questions." Part of this step is to ask open-ended style questions, not yes or no, close-ended questions. What do I mean by that? Let's walk through an example. Let's say I run into my coworker Amal, and this is an example of a close-ended question. "Hey Amal, I'm getting an RSpec error when running my create user test. I'm not sure why. Do you?" This question does not provide details. It's in a yes or no format, which doesn't allow further conversation. And thirdly, we haven't really told Amal what we already tried. The right way to ask this question is, "Hey Amal, I'm getting an RSpec error when running my create user test. I'm currently using Devise as my login, RSpec as testing, and Capybara. The error in my test has a false failure. I'm expecting it to pass. I looked at my logs and console and it said X. I did some research and read about why. I read on a couple things and I also looked at other files touching this code, but my test is still failing. Cool if we walk through it together?" This question is very detailed, open-ended, which engages dialogue, and we told Amal what we already tried, ensuring that we don't repeat steps, which allows us to work smarter. What I love about this step is that you can get unstuck simply by talking it through, and it works wonders when you unload your brain and you free up a lot of space to get to your solution. After a fruitful discussion with Amal, we couldn't get unstuck, so let's move on to step number 5. Step number 5 is step away, clear your head, take a break, go on a walk, play with your baby, take a breath, and just step away from your computer. Majority of the time, you need to give your brain a break after cranking through a technical problem for a while. Statistics show that 90% of North American employees that take breaks say it helps them feel refreshed and ready to get back to work. It might sound counterintuitive, especially in the hyper busy industry that we're in, but research from the Science Daily shows that it increases productivity. It increases productivity. It improves mental well-being, it boosts creativity, and it creates a healthy habit for you and your team. I feel super strongly about this because boosting creativity, because it's as software engineers, it requires being creative, and taking a break helps recharge your creative juices and ultimately allows you to work smarter. So let's take a speed break with me for a moment. In reality, your break should not be this short. Take a moment to just breathe with me. Close your eyes. Actually do it. Close your eyes. Take in a deep breath. Hold it for 4 seconds. And before you exhale the stress from the test failing, being stuck, feeling like an imposter, all the stress and anxiety of 2020. And let's try it one more time. Inhale. Hold it for 4 seconds. And exhale. How does that feel? Relaxing, I hope. At times, this is all our body and brain needs to get unstuck, is to recharge and start again with a fresh perspective. I hope that felt great. Now that we took a break and returned to our problem, I remembered something in step number 3, zooming out, that I missed. We made sure that the view code, the front end, was validating the password. But what about the back end? Let's take a look again at the user model. Looks like we have an issue in our user model. We are validating the email and the name, but not the password. We can write our own validation, but since we're using Devise, our authentication, they have a well-encompassing validation module that we can called validatable that validates the password presence, confirmation, and password length. If we add that to our user model and rerun our test, looks like it passes. Step 5 is what we needed to get unstuck. Great work, everybody. In summary, the 5 steps are: start by doing your own troubleshooting. Google very specific queries. Look at other pieces of the puzzle. 4, ask a classmate or a coworker. And 5, step away. And remember, if you get unstuck at any point, you can stop at that step. And remember, it's all about it's not about working harder, but working smarter. Throughout my career, I've used these steps to never feel the way I felt when I had that convo with the senior dev. I learned to change that stuck moment to a learning and empowering moment. I learned that these tips throughout my tech journey saved me lots of time and helped me get unstuck, and I hope it does the same for you. Now that I have this tool, not only did I become a stronger developer, but a more confident developer. And I hope if you follow these steps, you can too. Good night, Codeland, and good luck on your journey of working smarter and getting unstuck. And feel free to follow me on any of my socials.